I had never believed in the paranormal, not really. Sure, I liked scary stories as much as the next person, but they always felt like fiction. A way to thrill yourself for an hour or two, then turn off the lights and go to sleep, knowing deep down that none of it was real. That changed for me one weekend a few months ago. I had decided to spend a few days alone in a cabin that I rented from an old listing. It was isolated, surrounded by dense woods, perfect for the solitude I craved. The idea was to get away from the city, away from the constant noise, and just enjoy some quiet. I had no idea how badly I would come to regret that decision. The cabin itself was rustic, to say the least. Wooden, with a porch that creaked every time I stepped on it. There was no Wi-Fi, but I didn't mind. I had brought books, a few magazines, and my phone, though there was barely any signal. I settled in on the first night, stoked a small fire in the wood-burning stove, and sat down with a glass of wine, enjoying the silence. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that presses in around you and makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. I had gone to bed early, planning to wake up for a morning hike. The bedroom was small, just a bed and a wooden dresser, but it felt cozy. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the crackle of the fire in the other room. I woke up sometime later, my heart pounding for no apparent reason. I glanced at my phone. It was 12:23 a.m. Nothing had happened to wake me up, no sounds, no movement. But I felt off, like something was wrong, but I couldn't place what. I lay there for a while, listening to the quiet of the woods outside. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, convincing myself that it was just nerves from being alone. The next day was normal. I went on my hike, enjoyed the fresh air, and spent the afternoon reading on the porch. By the time the sun set, I was feeling more relaxed. I had made myself dinner and settled in for another quiet evening. I was halfway through a book when I heard a knock on the door. It was strange because I hadn't seen anyone in the area since I arrived. The cabin was miles away from the nearest house or road, so the idea of someone just showing up seemed unlikely. I opened the door, expecting to see nothing but the empty woods. Instead, an old man stood on the porch, his clothes worn and dirty. His eyes were wild, darting around as if he couldn't focus on one thing. He said nothing at first, just stared at me, breathing heavily. I tried to stay calm, asking if he was lost or needed help. He didn't answer. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. His voice was low, raspy, like he hadn't used it in a long time. "You should leave," he said. "This isn't a good place to stay." I stared at him, confused. I didn't know what to say. There was something about him that made me uneasy. He seemed off, like there was something wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I asked him why he was saying that, and he just shook his head, his eyes widening in a way that made my skin crawl. He took a step closer, and I could see the dirt caked under his fingernails, the way his skin seemed too tight for his face. "You need to go," he repeated, his voice more urgent now. "Before it gets dark." I didn't know what to do. Every instinct in me was telling me to slam the door, but there was something in his eyes that made me hesitate. Before I could respond, he turned and walked off the porch, disappearing into the trees without another word. I stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness where he had gone, my heart racing. I told myself it was nothing, that he was just some strange local who probably lived in the woods. Maybe he wasn't all there mentally. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I locked the door, checked the windows, and tried to go back to reading, but my mind kept returning to the man's words. Before it gets dark. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every little sound made me sit up, my eyes scanning the room for movement. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of something banging against the side of the cabin. It was loud, sudden, like someone was hitting the wall with their fist. My heart leapt into my throat. I reached for my phone, but the screen remained black when I pressed the power button. Dead. I cursed under my breath and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, shining it toward the window. Nothing, just the dark trees outside. I sat there for a long time, flashlight in hand, waiting for the noise to come again. But it didn't. After what felt like an eternity, I finally worked up the nerve to get out of bed and check the cabin. I opened the front door, the cool night air hitting my face as I stepped onto the porch. The woods were silent, eerily still, like the entire forest was holding its breath. Then I saw it. There, on the ground in front of the cabin, were footprints, not shoe prints, but bare feet. They led from the tree line up to the porch and stopped right in front of the door, right where I had been standing earlier when the old man had knocked. The prints were large, too large to belong to the man I had seen, and they seemed fresh. My skin prickled, and I quickly went back inside, locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, sitting in the living room with every light on, my back against the wall. I didn't hear any more noises, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something was out there, watching me, waiting. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to leave. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking as I shoved clothes into my bag. I was about to leave when I noticed something on the porch. A small piece of paper, folded neatly, sitting right in front of the door. My stomach dropped as I picked it up. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, like it had been sitting in the sun for years. I unfolded it, my hands trembling. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, and scrawled across the page were 3 words that made my blood run cold. It sees you. I dropped the paper, my heart racing. I grabbed my bag and ran to the car, not caring if I forgot anything. I threw my stuff into the back seat and started the engine, my hands shaking as I pulled out of the driveway. I didn't look back. As I drove down the dirt road, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches stretching out like long fingers. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting an eerie glow over the forest. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to focus on getting as far away from the cabin as possible. But then I saw it. In my rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road behind me, was the old man. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me drive away. His face was twisted into a smile, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was something else, something darker. His eyes glinted in the morning light, and I could see his mouth moving, as if he were speaking. But I couldn't hear him. I pressed the gas pedal harder, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I checked into a motel and locked myself in the room, finally allowing myself to breathe. That was the last time I ever went back to that cabin. I couldn't explain what had happened, couldn't shake the feeling that I had come too close to something I wasn't supposed to see. I don't know who that man was, or what he wanted. But I do know one thing. He wasn't warning me. He was inviting me. I had always been drawn to the quiet solitude of rural living. So when the opportunity arose to rent a small cabin nestled deep in the woods, I jumped at the chance. The owner had assured me it was a peaceful place, far removed from the hustle and bustle of city life. I packed my bags, excited to spend a weekend in tranquility. As I arrived at the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The cabin was quaint, with wooden beams and a stone fireplace that promised warmth during the chilly nights. I unpacked my belongings, relishing the aroma of fresh pine and the gentle rustle of leaves. It was perfect. The first evening was peaceful, filled with the sounds of nature. I lit a fire, brewed some coffee, and settled into a comfortable chair with a book. As darkness enveloped the woods, I heard the occasional rustle outside. I figured it was just the wind or perhaps a curious raccoon. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the walls, and I felt a wave of calm wash over me. As the night deepened, I heard something that sent a chill down my spine. It was a low, distant howl, unlike anything I had heard before. I glanced out the window, but all I could see was the thick curtain of trees obscuring my view. I shrugged it off, reminding myself I was just in a new environment. The second night, I was determined not to let my imagination run wild. I had prepared a hearty dinner and planned to watch a movie on my laptop. As I settled in, the howl echoed through the woods again. It was closer this time, a haunting sound that seemed to resonate in my bones. I paused the movie, straining to listen. The howl morphed into what sounded like a woman crying, a soft, mournful wail that sent shivers down my spine. Fighting the urge to flee, I reminded myself that I was safe inside the cabin. I resumed the movie, but I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling gnawing at me. The night dragged on, and the sounds continued. The crying came and went, accompanied by rustling outside that sounded more deliberate, almost as if something was prowling around the cabin. Determined to confront my fears, I opened the door and stepped outside. The night air was cool and crisp, and the moon bathed the clearing in silver light. I scanned the perimeter of the cabin, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing seemed out of place, yet an instinctual dread settled in the pit of my stomach. The howling returned, more frantic this time. My heart raced as I turned to head back inside, but as I reached for the door, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was cloaked in shadows, partially obscured by the trees. The figure was tall and thin, and it moved unnaturally, swaying slightly as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist. Frozen in place, I watched as it stepped forward, revealing a gaunt face with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light around it. The creature let out a sound that was a mix of a howl and a cry, and I stumbled back, slamming the door shut. My heart pounded in my chest as I locked it tight, feeling a surge of panic wash over me. I grabbed my phone and called the owner of the cabin, but the call went straight to voicemail. Frantically, I texted a friend, explaining what was happening and asking for help. No response came. The eerie feeling of isolation deepened as the howling echoed outside, mingling with the wails that seemed to draw closer. I turned off the lights, opting to hide in the darkness, hoping whatever was out there would lose interest. Hours passed, and the sounds continued to plague me, growing louder and more intense. I could hear footsteps around the cabin, shuffling sounds that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Just as I thought I might go mad from the fear, everything suddenly went quiet. The absence of sound was deafening. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. Then, a gentle tapping began on the window. I jumped, heart racing, and slowly turned to look. A pale hand pressed against the glass, fingers long and claw-like, scratching lightly as if beckoning me to come closer. I screamed, stumbling back from the window, and dashed to the other side of the cabin. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my backpack, throwing in my essentials and praying for dawn to break. I considered waiting until morning, but the thought of spending another minute in that cabin was unbearable. With adrenaline coursing through me, I opened the door cautiously, ready to bolt at the slightest noise. The woods were still cloaked in darkness, but I knew I had to make a run for it. Suddenly, the howling erupted again, but this time it was accompanied by laughter, soft, mocking, and chilling. I glanced over my shoulder to see that same figure standing in the shadows of the trees, watching me with those hollow eyes. Fear propelled me forward, and I fumbled with my keys, desperate to unlock the car. Just as I got the door open and jumped inside, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I turned the key in the ignition, but the car sputtered. Panic rose as I turned the key again, but it only wheezed and died. I could see the figure approaching slowly, its laughter echoing in the darkness. In a moment of sheer terror, I turned and threw the car into reverse, praying it would start. The engine roared to life, and I quickly shifted into drive, speeding down the dirt road. I glanced in the rearview mirror to see the figure standing there, illuminated briefly by my headlights. It seemed to dissolve into the shadows, swallowed by the night. I drove without stopping until I reached the main road, my heart still pounding in my chest. I turned on the radio, trying to drown out the silence. Just as I began to calm down, something flickered in my peripheral vision. I turned to look, and my stomach dropped. In the back seat, right behind me, sat the doll I had taken from the cabin. It was the same cracked porcelain face, one eye missing, staring blankly at me. A chill ran down my spine as I realized I had never brought it into the car. My heart raced as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to make sense of it all. In that moment, the laughter returned, echoing from the depths of the car, reverberating in my bones. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt on the side of the road. The headlights illuminated the trees, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw shadows moving among them. With a shaking hand, I reached for the doll. As I turned to face it, the laughter intensified, and the doll's face twisted into a sinister grin. It opened its mouth wide, and I felt a cold rush of air sweep through the car, filling it with an overpowering dread. In a split second, everything went black. The last thing I heard was the echo of that laughter, lingering in the darkness, as I was swallowed by the unknown. When I finally awoke, I was sitting in my car on the side of the road, sunlight pouring in through the windows. The doll was gone, as was the darkness that had consumed me. But I knew then that I would never return to that cabin again. Something had followed me home. The first time I stepped into the old house, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. My friends and I had come to this isolated location for a weekend getaway, seeking the thrill of exploring an abandoned building rumored to be haunted. As we parked the car and approached the front porch, the wind whispered through the trees, almost as if it were warning us to turn back. I shrugged off the feeling, attributing it to the eerie stories we had heard. The house stood tall but weary, its paint peeling and windows clouded with grime. It had been empty for years, a remnant of better days long gone. With flashlights in hand, we pushed the creaking door open, revealing a dark hallway that stretched before us. Dust motes floated in the beams of our lights as we ventured inside. The floorboards groaned under our weight, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. Our group consisted of me, my best friend Sarah, and our two adventurous friends, Tom and Jesse. We separated to explore different rooms, the thrill of discovery driving us. I wandered into what must have been the living room. A large, tattered sofa sat in the corner, and a broken chandelier dangled from the ceiling. The wallpaper peeled away like dead skin, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. As I took a step forward, I felt a sudden draft that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a figure in the corner of the room, but when I blinked, it was gone. My heart raced as I called out to my friends, but there was no response. I stepped cautiously toward the door when suddenly, I heard laughter from upstairs. It was Jessie. I knew her laugh well. I rushed to the staircase and climbed the creaky steps, the sound of my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I reached the second floor, where the laughter turned into muffled voices. I walked down the hallway, peeking into rooms. The first two were empty, but when I reached the last door, I hesitated. The voices were clearer now, but they sounded distorted, like they were coming from another world. I pushed the door open, and a rush of cold air greeted me. The room was dark, but my flashlight illuminated a small, dusty nursery filled with old toys and a crib in the corner. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking ominously beneath me. The voices stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. I called out to Jessie, but my voice felt swallowed by the darkness. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I turned sharply, my heart racing, and saw a small doll sitting on the floor, its porcelain face cracked and dirty. It was lifelike in a way that sent chills through me. I picked it up, examining it, and as I did, I felt a strange compulsion to look closer. Just then, the door slammed shut behind me. I jumped, the doll slipping from my hands and shattering on the floor. Panic surged through me, and I rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded on it, shouting for my friends. My breaths came in quick gasps as I realized I was trapped. I could feel the air growing colder, and an unsettling presence seemed to fill the room. Suddenly, I heard soft crying coming from the corner, and my heart dropped. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, and what I saw made my blood run cold. A small girl, no older than 5, stood there, her hair long and tangled, her dress tattered. Her eyes were wide with fear. I took a step back, terrified, and asked her if she was lost. She didn't respond but pointed toward the broken window. A rush of wind whipped through the room, knocking me off balance. I stumbled backward, and in that moment of chaos, the girl vanished. I gasped, frantically searching for her, but I was alone again. I banged on the door with renewed strength, shouting for help. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door swung open, and there stood Sarah, wide-eyed and panting. She pulled me out into the hallway, and I quickly told her what had just happened. She looked concerned but skeptical. "You must have been imagining things," she said gently, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. We regrouped with Tom and Jesse, who had been exploring the kitchen. I recounted my experience, and while they listened, I could sense an air of disbelief. We decided to move on and explore the basement, thinking the thrill of adventure would shake off the dread that had settled over us. As we descended the narrow staircase into the basement, the air grew colder still, and a musty smell assaulted our senses. The beam of our flashlights danced over the damp walls, revealing remnants of an old life, broken furniture, empty bottles, and old newspapers yellowed with age. The atmosphere felt thick, charged with something I couldn't quite identify. In the far corner of the basement, we found a large wooden trunk. It was covered in dust but seemed oddly out of place amidst the decay. Curiosity piqued, we gathered around it, and I knelt to examine the latch. It creaked open, revealing a collection of old photographs. As I sifted through them, my heart sank. The photos depicted a family happy moments, children playing, smiling faces. But as I flipped through them, I came across a disturbing trend. In each photo, there was a shadow lurking in the background, a dark figure that seemed to grow closer with each passing image. The last photograph sent chills through my spine. It was a picture of the same little girl I had seen earlier, her eyes wide and filled with a deep sadness. Behind her loomed the same dark figure, its features obscured. I felt the air grow heavy again, and a sudden cold draft swept through the basement. I turned to my friends, trying to articulate the terror I felt, but before I could speak, a loud bang echoed from above us. We all froze, exchanging terrified glances. It sounded like something heavy had fallen or been thrown across the floor. We shared a look of panic and decided to head back upstairs, our sense of dread deepening. The moment we reached the ground floor, we noticed something was off. The front door, which we had left securely locked, now stood ajar, swinging slowly in the wind. My stomach dropped as I stepped cautiously toward it. A strange, low growl emanated from outside, sending a wave of fear through me. Sarah reached for my arm, her eyes wide with terror. We should leave, now, but as we turned to run, we heard a soft, sing-song voice drifting through the air, calling out to us, "Come play with me." It was the little girl's voice, sweet and innocent, but layered with something sinister. We bolted for the door, adrenaline surging through our veins. I glanced back just as I crossed the threshold. The basement door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. I could feel an icy breath on my neck, and in that moment, I knew we weren't alone. We sprinted for the car, the chill of the night air stinging our skin. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I tried to unlock the door. Sarah stood watch, eyes darting around as if she could sense something lurking in the darkness. Finally, I managed to get the door open, and we all piled inside, slamming the doors shut. I turned the key in the ignition, but the engine sputtered, refusing to start. Panic washed over me as I tried again, but nothing happened. The growl returned, louder this time, shaking the car. I could see shadows moving outside, and in the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of the dark figure standing just outside the door, its features still hidden in the shadows. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed on the roof of the car. My heart raced, and I yelled for everyone to duck. As they complied, I glanced up to see the little girl's face peering through the window, her expression twisted into a horrific smile. She was no longer innocent. With a final, desperate effort, I turned the key one last time. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into reverse. I didn't stop to look back as I sped away, the haunted house shrinking in the distance. As we drove away, I could feel the weight of the darkness lift slightly, but the memory of the little girl's eyes haunted me. We reached a gas station several miles down the road and piled out of the car, shaken and breathless. "What the hell was that?" Tom exclaimed, his voice a mix of fear and disbelief. "I don't know," I replied, trying to catch my breath. "But we have to get out of here." Just then, I noticed something glimmering on the dashboard. It was the doll I had dropped in the nursery. My heart sank as I realized it had somehow found its way back to me, sitting innocently as if nothing had happened. And then I understood. The little girl had been trying to warn me. She had been trapped there for years, and now she was free, leaving the darkness behind. But whatever had been lurking in that house was still with us. I looked around, panic rising within me, but no one else seemed to notice. The shadows stretched longer as the sun began to set, and I knew we hadn't escaped. The dark figure had followed us, and it wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted. We were not safe. Not yet. I never considered myself a superstitious person. Ghost stories, tales of hauntings, and supernatural things never really got to me. I was the type who brushed them off with a smirk or shrug whenever someone claimed they had seen something unexplainable. That was until the night I came face to face with something I still can't explain, something so terrifying that it still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. It was last October when it all happened. I had just moved into a new house, a cozy little place in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't isolated, but it had an eerie calmness to it, especially at night. The backyard was large and bordered by a thick line of trees, separating my property from a small forest. The house had its quirks, like any old place: creaky floors, drafty windows, but nothing too unusual. I had lived there for a few weeks without any problems, enjoying the peace and quiet. One Saturday evening, I decided to spend the night in, enjoying the solitude. I planned to watch a few horror movies and relax. It seemed fitting for the chilly October air and the atmosphere the season brought. I made some popcorn, poured myself a drink, and settled into the couch with a thick blanket. It was well into the night when the first strange thing happened. I had paused the movie to grab a snack from the kitchen when I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a raccoon rummaging through the trash. But this sound was different. It was deliberate, like footsteps, slow and heavy. I stopped mid-step and listened. The sound seemed to be coming from the backyard, near the line of trees. I stood there for a moment, debating whether or not to check it out. Curiosity won, and I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer. I went to the back door and flicked on the porch light, peering out through the window. At first, I saw nothing unusual. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the backyard was still, bathed in the dim light of the porch. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw movement. Something or someone was standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the light's reach. My breath caught in my throat as I squinted, trying to get a better look. The figure was tall, and naturally tall, and seemed to be just standing there, watching. I felt a chill run down my spine. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light, or maybe even a neighbor playing a prank. I had never met my neighbors, but it wasn't far-fetched to think that someone might be messing around. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of reacting. I turned off the porch light and went back inside, determined to shake off the unease and get back to my movie. But as the night wore on, the strange noises didn't stop. I kept hearing that same steady, deliberate thumping outside, like footsteps pacing back and forth along the tree line. I tried to ignore it, turning up the volume on the TV, but the sound was persistent. It was as if someone or something wanted me to know they were there. Around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight again and opened the back door, stepping out onto the porch. The cold air bit at my skin as I scanned the backyard with the beam of light. The trees loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding, but there was no sign of anyone. Just as I was about to head back inside, I heard it again. A soft, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. I swung the flashlight toward the trees, and my heart skipped a beat. The tall figure was back, standing at the same spot, only this time it was closer, just a few feet away from where the light ended. I stood frozen, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I could make out more details now. The figure was draped in what looked like a long, tattered cloak. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. Without thinking, I turned and bolted back inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the door, the fear finally sinking in. I wasn't imagining things. There was someone or something out there. I spent the next hour pacing around the house, checking the windows, making sure every door was locked. The noises outside continued, but I didn't dare look out again. I turned off all the lights and sat in the living room, listening to the eerie sounds of the night. Every creak, every rustle made my skin crawl. It was around 2 a.m. when the banging started. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was loud, insistent, like someone was pounding on the back door. I jumped to my feet, heart racing, and ran to the door. The sound was deafening now, like fists slamming against the wood. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter, gripping it tightly as I stood by the door. The pounding continued, each thud vibrating through the house. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. For a moment, everything was deathly silent. My pulse thudded in my ears as I stood there, waiting for whatever came next. And then, I heard a soft whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from the other side of the door. "Let me in." He backed away slowly, not daring to open the door. I wasn't sure what I would find on the other side, but I knew it wasn't anything good. I could feel the air in the room shift, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. Suddenly, the whisper came again, louder this time, almost demanding. "Let me in." My blood ran cold as I realized the voice wasn't coming from outside the door anymore. It was coming from inside the house. I turned around, scanning the dark room, but nothing seemed out of place. The whisper continued, growing louder, more insistent, filling my head until I could hardly think. My hands were shaking, and I could barely hold onto the knife anymore. I had to get out. I didn't care what was outside. Anything was better than staying in that house. I grabbed my keys and made a dash for the front door, flinging it open and sprinting out into the yard. As I ran down the driveway, I glanced back at the house one last time. That's when I saw it. The figure from the forest was standing in the doorway, tall and imposing, watching me. But it wasn't just one figure anymore. There were more of them, stepping out from the shadows, lining the yard, their faces obscured by darkness. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I jumped in, locking the doors, and sped down the street, not daring to look back. I didn't return to that house after that night. I packed up my things the next day and moved out. I don't know what I saw, or what was trying to get inside, but I never want to experience anything like that again. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind howls outside and the house creaks, I still hear that whisper, "Let me in." I had always been a skeptic, the kind of person who rolled their eyes at ghost stories and laughed at horror movies. To me, The world made sense in logical terms, and the unexplained was just something that hadn't been explained yet. That was until the summer I moved into a house that seemed normal in every way. It was a quiet little place, far enough from the city to be peaceful, but close enough to work to be convenient. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking, fixing small things around the house, and settling into my new routine. The neighborhood was friendly enough, though I didn't see much of anyone. The house next to mine seemed empty, the lawn overgrown, and the shutters closed. I figured it was abandoned, or maybe the owner had gone away for a while. Then one day, I came home from work and found a note slipped under my door. It was written in sloppy, almost childlike handwriting. It said, "I hope you're enjoying your new house." I looked around, confused, but there was no one in sight. It felt odd, but not particularly threatening. Maybe one of the neighbors had decided to leave me a strange, belated welcome message. I shrugged it off, crumpled the note, and tossed it in the trash. A few nights later, something woke me up. It was around 3 in the morning, and the house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak from the walls. I had been in the middle of a dream, something about being chased, though I couldn't remember much of it. As I lay there, trying to shake off the lingering unease, I heard a sound from outside. At first, it was faint, like someone shuffling their feet in the grass. Then it became more distinct, like heavy footsteps crunching over dry leaves. I sat up in bed and listened, my heart beginning to race. It sounded like it was coming from the direction of the neighboring house, the one I had assumed was empty. I got out of bed and moved quietly to the window, pulling the curtain back just a little. The moon was bright, casting a pale light over the yard and the old house next door. For a moment, everything looked still. Then I saw it. There was a figure standing just outside the old house, near the edge of my property. It was tall, but hunched over, as if it were trying to make itself smaller. I couldn't make out any details in the dim light, but it seemed to be watching my house. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. It didn't move, just stood there, staring. I don't know how long I stood at the window, but eventually, the figure turned and walked slowly back toward the old house, disappearing into the shadows. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Something about the way it moved, so deliberate, so unnatural, made my stomach turn. I closed the curtain and sat back on the bed, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The next morning, I decided to check out the old house. I told myself it was just curiosity, that maybe the figure was a neighbor I hadn't met yet. The house looked even more abandoned up close. The windows were covered in grime, and the door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open with a creak and stepped inside. The air was heavy and stale, as if the place hadn't been opened in years. There was a thick layer of dust on the floor, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. I called out, but there was no response. I wasn't sure what I expected, but the silence only made the place feel more ominous. I was about to leave when I noticed something strange. In the middle of the living room floor, there was a small pile of objects. They looked like toys, old and broken, scattered across the dust-covered floor. A doll with missing eyes, a toy truck with one wheel, and a teddy bear with its stuffing spilling out. It felt wrong, like they didn't belong there, and yet they seemed to have been deliberately placed in a neat little arrangement. I backed out of the house and hurried home, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread that had settled in my chest. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking them before I went to bed, but it didn't matter. I woke up again at 3 in the morning, the same time as before. This time, I didn't hear footsteps. Instead, there was a soft tapping sound, like something lightly knocking against the wall of my bedroom. I held my breath, straining to hear. It was slow and rhythmic, a steady tap 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 coming from outside the house. I forced myself out of bed and moved to the window, heart pounding in my chest. I pulled back the curtain, and my blood ran cold. The figure was back, standing in the exact same spot as before, only this time, it was closer. I could see more details now. Its body was thin and twisted, like it didn't belong to a human. Its arms were unnaturally long, hanging down past its knees, and its head was tilted at an odd angle, as if it were trying to get a better look at me. My breath caught in my throat as it lifted one of its long arms and slowly pointed at me. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing, and grabbed my phone to call the police. I tried to explain what I had seen, but my words came out jumbled, panicked. They said they would send someone over to check things out, but I could tell from the dispatcher's tone that they didn't believe me. I waited, pacing back and forth, Maya's darting toward the window every few seconds. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a knock at the door. I jumped, my nerves on edge, but it was the police. Two officers stood on my porch, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I told them what had happened, and they agreed to take a look around. They checked the yard, the old house, and even the woods behind the property, but found nothing. The figure was gone, and there were no signs of anyone having been there. The officers left, clearly thinking I had just imagined the whole thing, but I knew what I had seen. The next few nights were quiet. I tried to convince myself that it had been a prank, that maybe someone in the neighborhood was messing with me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Then, one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it again. The soft tapping, slow and deliberate. This time, it was coming from the front door. I froze, my hand halfway to the light switch. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed my phone and started dialing the police again, but before I could hit the call button, the tapping stopped. Silence filled the house. I waited, my heart hammering in my chest, and, without warning, there was a loud crash from the back of the house, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I ran to the kitchen, but when I got there, everything was still. The door to the backyard was open, swinging gently in the breeze. I grabbed a knife from the counter and stepped outside, my pulse racing. The yard was empty, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows. I turned back toward the house and froze. The figure was standing just inside the door, its long arms reaching out toward me. Its head tilted again, that same unnatural angle, as if it were trying to decide what to do next. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to run. But before I could move, the figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. I bolted toward the front of the house, throwing the door open and running into the street. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the block, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked back, but the figure was gone. The police came again, and again they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. I knew then that I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I packed my things the next day and left, moving as far away as I could. But the story doesn't end there. A few months later, I received a letter in the mail. There was no return address, and the handwriting was sloppy, almost childlike. It said, "I hope you're enjoying your new house." I had never been one to believe in anything paranormal. Growing up, I scoffed at ghost stories and tales of haunted houses. My friends always said I was too rational, too grounded in reality to ever be spooked by things that go bump in the night. But everything changed when I moved into that house. It was an old house, sure, but it had charm. Two stories, creaky wooden floors, and a wraparound porch that felt like it belonged in a movie. The rent was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but I didn't care. It was my first place on my own, and I was excited to have space to myself. The first few days were peaceful. I unpacked, set up my furniture, and explored every nook and cranny of the place. It had an odd layout, with rooms that seemed to twist and turn, hallways that didn't quite make sense, and a few doors that seemed to lead nowhere. I chalked it up to the house being old. Maybe it had gone through renovations over the years. But there was one door that gave me an uneasy feeling from the start. It was in the upstairs hallway, tucked away in the corner, barely noticeable. It didn't seem to lead anywhere, and when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge, locked. I didn't think much of it at first. The house had its quirks, but nothing out of the ordinary. Until the third night. It started with a noise. Not the usual creaks of an old house settling or the wind whistling through the windows. This was different. It was a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I had been lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. My eyes snapped open, and I lay still, straining to listen. The sound was coming from above me. I sat up, confused. There was no attic in the house, just the roof. How could there be noise coming from above? I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was an animal on the roof, and eventually, I fell back asleep. But the next night, it happened again. The same scraping sound, only this time, it was louder, more deliberate. It lasted for a good 10 minutes before stopping abruptly. I sat up in bed, wide awake, my heart racing. I was starting to feel unnerved. The following day, I mentioned it to my neighbor, an older woman who had lived in the area for decades. She gave me a strange look, her face tightening with concern. "You're living in that house," she said, almost as if it explained everything. I asked her what she meant, but she just shook her head and muttered something about the house's history, about it having been abandoned for years before I moved in. When I pressed her for more details, she changed the subject, and I didn't push it. That night, the noise returned, louder than ever. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs, determined to figure out what was going on. The scraping sound had always come from above my bedroom, which meant it had to be near the locked door in the hallway. I stood in front of it, my heart pounding in my chest. The door looked the same as it always had, but now, in the dim light, it felt more ominous. I tried the handle again, but it was still locked. Frustrated, I started knocking on the door, as if expecting someone to answer. I'm not sure what I was thinking. I was just on edge, desperate for answers. But then, as I turned to walk away, I heard a faint click behind me. I froze and slowly turned back to the door. The handle had shifted slightly, just enough to show it was no longer locked. My breath caught in my throat. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct in my body telling me to leave it alone, to go back downstairs and forget about the door. But curiosity got the better of me. I reached out, grasped the handle, and pulled. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading up. I hadn't realized there was an attic. The air was thick and cold, and a musty smell wafted down the stairs. I shined my flashlight into the darkness, but the beam barely penetrated the gloom. I couldn't see the top of the stairs. Something inside me told me to go back, but I was already committed. I stepped forward, the wooden stairs creaking under my weight, and made my way up. Each step felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. The further I went, the colder it got, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. When I reached the top, I found myself in a small, cramped room. The roof slanted low, and there was barely enough space to stand. Dust coated everything, and the air was so thick with it that I could taste it. But what caught my attention was the large, wooden chest in the corner. It looked ancient, covered in cobwebs and worn from time. Without thinking, I approached the chest, my flashlight flickering slightly as I knelt down. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the latch, before finally opening it. Inside, I found old photographs, yellowed with age, and strange trinkets that looked like they belonged to another century. But what really made my blood run cold was a small, worn journal resting at the bottom. I picked it up, my fingers trembling, and flipped it open. The writing was old, the ink faded, but I could still make out the words. It was a diary, written by someone who had lived in the house long ago. The entries started off normal enough, detailing daily life, but as I read further, the tone grew more frantic, more paranoid. The writer spoke of hearing noises in the night, of feeling watched, of seeing strange figures moving in the shadows. But the last few entries were the worst. They spoke of a presence in the house, something dark and malevolent, something that was trying to get in. The final entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted. I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing. I needed to get out of there. As I stood to leave, I heard it again. The scraping sound, but this time, it wasn't coming from above. It was coming from behind me, from the hallway. My blood turned to ice. Slowly, I turned around, shining my flashlight toward the open door. The hallway was empty, but the scraping continued, growing louder, closer. I backed away, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. My flashlight flickered again, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And then, just as I was about to bolt down the stairs, the light went out completely. I was plunged into darkness. I fumbled with the flashlight, desperately trying to get it to work, but it was no use. The scraping sound was right behind me now, so close that I could feel the vibrations through the floor. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my ears. Slowly, I took a step forward, then another. I reached the top of the stairs, my hands shaking as I felt for the railing. I took one more step, then I heard it, a whisper, so faint I almost didn't catch it. It was right next to my ear, a voice so cold and hollow that it felt like ice running down my spine. Leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I sprinted down the stairs, not caring how loud I was or if I tripped. I just needed to get out. I flew down the hallway, past the living room, and out the front door. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling, and finally managed to start the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away. The next morning, I returned to the house with a locksmith, determined to put everything behind me. But when we arrived, something was off. The front door was wide open, even though I had locked it the night before. I stepped inside cautiously, the locksmith following behind me. Everything was as I had left it, except for one thing. The door to the upstairs hallway was gone. Not locked, not ajar, completely gone, as if it had never existed. I stood there, dumbfounded, my mind racing to make sense of it. The locksmith looked at me, confused, but I had no explanation to give him. The door, the attic, the chest, it was all gone. To this day, I don't know what happened in that house. I don't know if I imagined it all, or if something far more sinister was at play. All I know is that I never went back. I packed my things and moved out as soon as I could, and I haven't looked back since. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm alone, I can still hear it, the scraping. I had always considered myself a skeptic. Ghost stories, supernatural occurrences, they were fun to talk about but never something I took seriously. That all changed last fall. Even now, I get chills when I think about it, and I haven't shared this with anyone. Until now. It started when I moved into a new house. I was excited, a bit too excited maybe. I had been looking for a place outside of the city, something quieter, more isolated. After years of living in cramped apartments, the idea of a small house with a yard, surrounded by trees, sounded like heaven. The house I found was perfect, or so it seemed. A quaint two-bedroom cottage on the edge of a small town. No neighbors for miles, and the rent was incredibly cheap. Too cheap maybe, but I didn't question it. I just assumed I'd lucked out. The first few nights were peaceful. The quiet was almost overwhelming at first, but I quickly grew to love it. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. The house itself was old, but it had character, as they say. Creaky floorboards, drafty windows, nothing out of the ordinary for a place its age. I figured I'd eventually get used to it. Then, things started happening. It was subtle at first, small things that I tried to brush off. One night, I was lying in bed reading when I heard a faint thudding sound. It seemed to come from the living room. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the sound continued. A slow, deliberate thump, almost like footsteps. I turned off the light and listened carefully, straining to make out any other sounds. The thumping stopped. I chalked it up to an overactive imagination. Too many horror movies, I told myself. But the next night, it happened again. This time, it was louder. I could hear it clearly. Footsteps in the hallway. I got out of bed, heart pounding in my chest, and crept toward the door. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the small nightlight I had plugged in by the stairs. I peered down the hall, holding my breath, but there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped as soon as I stepped out of the room. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. When nothing happened, I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But I didn't sleep much that night. Things escalated quickly after that. About a week later, I was sitting in the living room late at night, catching up on some work. The house was quiet, and I had all but forgotten about the strange noises. That's when I heard it, a soft scratching sound, like nails scraping against wood. It was coming from outside, near the front door. My stomach tightened, and I slowly stood up, listening. The scratching continued, getting louder and more frantic. I grabbed my phone and walked toward the door, every step feeling heavier than the last. As I reached for the doorknob, the scratching stopped. Silence. My hand hovered over the knob, and I hesitated for a moment. Then, without warning, there was a loud bang against the door, like something had slammed into it. I jumped back, heart racing, and stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open, but nothing happened. I waited, breathless, for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, I unlocked the door and yanked it open, my heart pounding in my ears. The porch was empty, no sign of anyone, no footprints in the dirt, nothing. I stepped outside, shining the light from my phone around the yard. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like something was watching me from the darkness. I quickly went back inside and locked the door, every window, everything I could. I sat in the living room with the lights on, trying to calm myself down. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something I couldn't see. That night, I barely slept out the following morning. I told myself it was probably just some animal. Maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The noises, the footsteps, the scratching, it was too deliberate, too human. Still, I tried to push it out of my mind. I had work to do, and I couldn't afford to let my imagination get the better of me. That evening, as the sun began to set, I noticed something strange. The air felt different, heavier somehow. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the atmosphere in the house had changed. There was a tension, like the house itself was holding its breath. I tried to ignore it and went about my usual routine, making dinner, watching TV, anything to distract myself. But as night fell, the feeling of unease grew stronger. I kept hearing faint noises, creaks, groans, the occasional thud. The noises were too intentional, too rhythmic. Then, just after midnight, it happened again. The scratching, this time, it was louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the front door, though. It was coming from the back, near the kitchen. I froze, listening as the scratching grew more frantic. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy flashlight, and crept toward the kitchen. The scratching continued, growing louder with each step I took. When I reached the kitchen, I could see the back door. The scratching was right there, on the other side. I stood there, staring at the door, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. My breath was shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. And then, without warning, the scratching stopped. The silence was deafening. I slowly walked up to the door and peered through the small window. I couldn't see anything outside, just the darkness and the faint outline of the trees swaying in the wind. I let out a shaky breath and reached for the doorknob, hesitating for a moment before turning it. The door creaked open, and I stepped outside, shining the flashlight into the yard. Nothing, just the same empty yard, the same trees, the same shadows. I took a few steps forward, scanning the area, my heart still racing. The air felt thick, oppressive, like something was watching me from the shadows. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the yard, near the tree line, something was moving. It was low to the ground, hunched over, its limbs long and twisted. My flashlight caught it for just a second, enough to make out its shape. It was crawling, scuttling away from the house, its movements unnatural and jerky. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The creature stopped, turned its head toward me, and I saw its eyes, two glowing orbs in the darkness, fixed on me. For a split second, we were locked in a silent stare. Then, without warning, it darted into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. I stumbled backward, my hands trembling, and slammed the door shut behind me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it real? Had I imagined it? My rational brain tried to tell me it was just an animal, maybe a coyote or a stray dog. But deep down, I knew better. That thing wasn't natural. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, clutching the flashlight like it was the only thing keeping me safe. The house felt different now, like it was alive, like it was hiding something. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed up my things and left. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, didn't try to explain why I was leaving so suddenly. I just knew I had to get out of there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing watching me from the tree line. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind me. I haven't been back to that house since, and I don't plan to. I still can't explain what happened, and I'm not sure I ever will. But one thing is certain, whatever was in that house, whatever was out there in the darkness, it wasn't human, and it was waiting for me. But here's the twist. Months after I moved out, I got a call from the landlord. He was asking about some things left behind in the attic. I hadn't touched the attic. It was locked the entire time I lived there, and I hadn't thought much of it. Out of curiosity, I asked him what he found. His answer sent chills down my spine. He said the attic was empty except for one thing, a small, old chair facing a window. On the chair was a single item, a dusty, cracked porcelain doll. Its eyes were missing. And, scrawled in the dust on the window, were the words, "See you soon." I had always been a skeptic. Ghosts, spirits, and the supernatural were stories people told to entertain themselves around campfires or scare kids into behaving. I never gave them much thought, brushing off any eerie feelings as a trick of the mind or an overactive imagination. That changed the night I found myself alone in a house that seemed to breathe. It started like any other quiet evening. My job required a lot of travel, and I had rented a house just outside of town for a few days while I worked on a new project. It was an old place, but well kept. The landlord, an older man with kind eyes, had told me it had been in his family for generations. He said he lived nearby and gave me his number if I needed anything. It seemed like a perfect place to unwind after long workdays. The first night passed without incident. The house creaked and groaned a bit, but that was normal for any old structure. I spent the evening relaxing, reading, and enjoying the quiet. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel wrong. I had finished dinner and was about to settle in with a movie when I heard a faint sound coming from the far end of the house. It wasn't loud, just a soft shuffling noise, like something sliding across the floor. I paused the movie and sat still, listening intently. The sound stopped. I brushed it off as the house settling and pressed play again, sinking back into the couch. A few minutes later, it happened again. This time, it was louder, more deliberate, like someone dragging their feet across the hardwood floor. I paused the movie once more and stared down the dim hallway that led to the back rooms of the house. There was nothing, just darkness. I told myself it was nothing, just the old house making noise, and tried to relax. But the uneasy feeling settled in my stomach, growing stronger with each passing minute. Something about the silence felt oppressive, almost as if the house itself was holding its breath. I tried to focus on the movie, but every small noise, the wind brushing against the windows, the refrigerator humming, the occasional creak from the floor seemed louder, more insistent. I glanced at my phone, thinking about calling someone, but it was late, and I didn't want to sound ridiculous. I turned up the volume and settled back into the couch. That's when I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a shuffling, it was a distinct thud, like something heavy being dropped onto the floor. It came from the room at the end of the hall. My heart began to race, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I grabbed my phone and stood up, moving cautiously toward the hallway. My hand hovered over the light switch, but for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to turn it on. I peered down the dark hallway, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The sound came again, another thud, closer this time. My pulse quickened, and I felt a surge of adrenaline. I took a deep breath and forced myself to walk toward the back of the house. The hallway seemed longer than I remembered, the shadows darker, the air colder. When I reached the door to the back room, I hesitated for a moment before turning the handle and pushing it open. The room was empty. I stood there for a moment, staring into the darkness, trying to rationalize what I had heard. Maybe something had fallen. Maybe it was a mouse or a raccoon in the walls. But as I stepped inside, something felt off. The air was thick, suffocating, and there was a faint smell, something I couldn't quite place, but it reminded me of damp earth, like a freshly dug grave. I turned on the light, but nothing seemed out of place. The bed was neatly made, the curtains were drawn, and there was no sign of anything that could have caused the noise. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck as I scanned the room. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I left the room, shutting the door behind me, and headed back to the living room. The house felt different now, like it was watching me. I tried to ignore the feeling and sat back on the couch, determined to finish the movie and forget about the strange noises. But then, just as I pressed play, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a soft whisper, so faint I almost didn't catch it. It sounded like it was coming from right behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I slowly turned to look. There was nothing there, just the empty living room. But the whisper came again, clearer this time. It wasn't words exactly, more like the sound of someone exhaling, right next to my ear. I shot up from the couch, my heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and started dialing the landlord's number. But before I could hit call, I heard a loud crash from the back room, the same room I had just checked. I didn't want to go back there. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave the house, but I couldn't. I needed to know what was going on. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and made my way back down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The door to the back room was open. I knew I had closed it. My hand trembled as I shone the flashlight into the room. The bed was overturned, the curtains were torn, and the smell of damp earth was stronger than before. I took a step inside, shining the light over the walls and floor. That's when I saw it. On the floor, in the center of the room, was a large, circular patch of dirt. It wasn't there earlier. The dirt was loose, like something had been dug up or buried. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. How could this have happened in the span of a few minutes? And then I saw it, something was moving in the dirt. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly, but as I watched in horror, the dirt began to shift and rise. A hand, pale and skeletal, broke the surface, followed by an arm. My legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot as the figure pulled itself from the ground. It was humanoid but twisted, its skin stretched tight over its bones, its eyes hollow and black. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight as I scrambled for the door. The thing turned its head toward me, its mouth stretching into a wide and natural grin. It let out a low, guttural laugh that echoed through the room, sending a wave of cold terror through me. I bolted down the hallway, my feet barely touching the ground as I raced for the front door. I could hear the thing behind me, its laughter growing louder, closer. I fumbled with the lock, my fingers slipping as I tried to pull the door open. Just as I yanked it open, I heard the thing whisper again, right next to my ear. "Come back." He slammed the door behind me and ran to my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the driveway, glancing in the rearview mirror. The house stood there, dark and silent, but I could still feel it watching me. I drove for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest, until I finally pulled over on the side of the road, gasping for breath. I didn't know where I was, but I didn't care. I was far away from that house, and that was all that mattered. I called the landlord the next morning and told him I was leaving. I didn't give him details, just that I had an emergency and needed to leave immediately. He didn't seem surprised. In fact, there was a strange pause on the other end of the line before he spoke. "I understand," he said. "You're not the first one to leave early." You didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't want to know. A few weeks later, out of morbid curiosity, I looked up the history of the house. I found an old newspaper article about a family that had lived there decades ago. According to the article, the family had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind nothing but an overturned bed and a strange patch of dirt in the back room. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know, but I do know one thing: I will never, ever go back to that house. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling and the house creaks, I swear I can still hear that whisper, "Come back."